Colonel Marcus Hale grabbed the quiet man by the collar and shoved him backward off the firing line in front of 40 of the best snipers in the United States military. "Civilians don't belong on my range," Hale snarled. "Get your washed-up hide off my mountain before I have the MPs drag you off." The man in the plain gray jacket didn't swing, didn't flinch. He just looked at Hale with the calm, terrible patience of a man who had ended lives from over a mile away and let it go. Because what Colonel Hale didn't know was this: in 6 hours, a JSOC general would land on that mountain walk past every officer present and salute the man he'd just thrown in the dirt. Before we go further, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe the quiet ones are the dangerous ones, hit subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what happens on that canyon. Ethan Carter parked his old pickup at the bottom of the access road and sat there a moment with both hands on the wheel. He wasn't nervous. He'd stopped being nervous about anything a long time ago. But there was a photograph clipped to his sun visor, his daughter Lily, 6 years old, gap-toothed, holding a paper star she'd made in kindergarten, and he looked at it the way some men look at a compass. "Okay, sweetheart," he said quietly to no one. "One more time. Then I come home." He climbed out, gray jacket-worn jeans boots that had seen 100 deployments and 1,000 school drop-offs. No rank, no ribbons, no uniform. He'd folded that part of his life into a footlocker 3 years ago and hadn't opened it since. The call had come 4 days earlier. A number he didn't recognize. A voice he did. "Chief," the voice had said. Just that word, and Ethan's whole spine had straightened out of old habit. "It's Reyes. I need you on a mountain in 3 days. I can't tell you why on this line, but I wouldn't ask if it wasn't real." Ethan had looked across the kitchen at Lily coloring at the table. "I've got a little girl now, Major," he'd said. "I know," Reyes had answered. "That's exactly why I'm calling you and not somebody else. 3 days, Ethan. There's a life on the other end of this." So here he was. The range sat 2,000 feet up, carved into a ridge with a canyon yawning open on the far side, a brutal wind-scoured stretch of rock the Army used to separate the good shooters from the great ones. Ethan walked up the last 100 yards on foot, and the first thing he heard was a man's voice booming across the plateau like he owned the sky itself. "Weak. That's what I'm looking at. I've got 40 so-called elite operators, and not one of you can put steel on target past 1,000 meters." Ethan slowed, watched. The man doing the shouting wore a colonel's eagles and mirrored sunglasses, and the kind of posture that only comes from a career spent being obeyed. Colonel Marcus Hale. Ethan didn't know him, but he knew the type, knew it in his bones. A young Army sergeant was walking back from the firing line, rifle slung jaw tight, shame burning off him like heat. "Sir, the crosswind in that canyon is—" "The crosswind is an excuse," Hale snapped. "Winners adapt, losers explain. Which one are you, Sergeant?" The kid said nothing, just stared at the dirt. Ethan felt something old and quiet turn over in his chest. He'd been that kid once. A long time ago. That was when Hale noticed him. The colonel's head swiveled and the mirrored lenses fixed on the man in the gray jacket, standing at the edge of his range, hands loose at his sides, watching his soldiers. "You?" Hale barked. "This is a restricted military exercise. Who the hell are you?" Every head on the plateau turned. 40 of the best snipers in the country, and suddenly all of them were looking at the middle-aged civilian who'd wandered onto a classified course in street clothes. Ethan didn't reach for a badge, didn't puff up. He just said evenly, "Name's Carter. I was told to report here." "Told by who?" "Couldn't say Colonel." Hale walked toward him slow, letting his boots crunch on the gravel, drawing it out the way a man does when he wants an audience to watch him win. "Couldn't say." Hale repeated loud enough for everyone. "You hear that, gentlemen? A man in blue jeans wanders onto a live fire range that half the Pentagon doesn't have clearance for, and he couldn't say who sent him." He stopped 2 feet from Ethan and took off the sunglasses so the whole crowd could see him do it. "Let me guess. You did a couple tours a lifetime ago. You've got a shadow box on your wall and a bar you tell stories at. And somebody told you to come feel important again. A couple of the younger soldiers laughed, not because it was funny, because that's what men do when a predator picks a target, and they're just relieved it isn't them. Ethan looked back at him, didn't blink. "Something like that," he said. The mildness of it seemed to enrage Hale more than any pushback could have. "You know what I hate," the colonel said. "I hate a spectator. I've got the finest young warriors this country produces, failing my course today, and I will not have some has-been standing on my mountain like he's judging them." He jabbed a finger toward the road. "Off my range. Now, before I have you removed." Ethan held his ground, one beat longer than a scared man would have. Then he simply nodded, turned, and walked 20 yards back down the ridge to a flat outcrop of rock, still on the mountain, but off the firing line, and sat down. Hale stared after him, momentarily wrong-footed. He'd expected an argument, arguments he could win. This quiet obedience left him with nowhere to land his fist. "Enjoy the show, old-timer," he called after him and turned back to his soldiers with a clap of his hands. "All right, reset next shooter up, and this time somebody hit something before I lose my faith in the entire armed forces." Ethan sat on his rock and watched. That was the thing nobody understood about him. The thing that had made him a legend in circles that would never say his name out loud. He watched. He watched the way most people breathed without effort, without thought all the time. And within 10 minutes of sitting on that outcrop, he understood more about that canyon than Colonel Hale had learned in the 2 years he'd run this course. He watched the grass on the far ridge lean and recover. He watched a hawk ride a thermal up out of the canyon and get shoved sideways 200 feet in by a cross-current that wasn't visible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. He watched dust kick off a ledge at the 800-meter mark and drift the wrong way against the wind everyone up top could feel on their faces. 2 winds, he thought. Maybe 3. The canyon's got its own weather, and these kids are shooting like there's only one. Down on the line, another operator, an Army Special Forces sergeant by his tab. A genuinely gifted shooter settled behind his rifle, read the flags. Hale's staff had set up, dialed his dope, and squeezed. The round sailed a 1.5 feet right of the steel. "Miss!" the spotter called. Hale threw up his hands. "1.5 feet. At 1,000 meters, that's not a miss. That's a joke. My grandmother could." "Sir?" The sergeant came up off the rifle, and to his credit, his voice stayed level, even though his hands were shaking with fury. "With respect, the flags say one thing. The canyon's doing another. My round's getting picked up by something down in that draw that we can't read from up here." "Then read it better." "How, sir?" the sergeant said quietly. "You tell me how and I'll hit it every time." And Hale had no answer, because he didn't know either. That was the secret rotting at the center of the colonel's whole operation. The thing that woke him at 3 in the morning, his course was failing. Not because his men were weak, but because he had never cracked that canyon himself, and blaming the soldiers was the only way to keep the failure from landing on his own desk. So he did what men like Hale always do. "Sit down," he snapped at the sergeant. "You're done. Next." The young man who sat down next to Ethan wasn't supposed to be over there. He was a Corporal 23 maybe, with the kind of open face that hadn't yet learned to hide anything. He'd already shot, already missed, already been told he was a disappointment to the uniform. And instead of stewing with the others, he'd wandered off to the edge and found the quiet old man sitting on a rock and sat down beside him because misery apparently wanted company. "You really get thrown off the line?" the corporal asked. "Yep," Ethan said. "Colonel's in rare form today." The kid rubbed his face. "We're all getting torn apart out there. Best shooters I ever met, and every single one of us is choking. It's like the mountain's cursed." Ethan was quiet a moment. Then he said, "It's not cursed. You're just listening to the wrong wind." The corporal turned and looked at him. "What?" Ethan lifted his chin toward the canyon without pointing. Pointing draws attention, and he'd spent a career not drawing attention. "See that hawk been up there 10 minutes, Watch what happens when he crosses the middle of the draw." The corporal watched. The hawk sailed out over the canyon smooth and easy, and then hit the center and got kicked sideways so hard he had to flare his wings and fight for it. The kid's mouth opened slightly. "There's a river of air running crossways down the throat of that canyon," Ethan said, still not pointing, voice low and even like he was talking about the weather because it was the weather. "Your flag's up top, read the wind on the plateau. 9-10 miles an hour left to right. Real gentle. So everybody's dialing for a gentle left to right." He shook his head slowly. "But your bullet doesn't live up here on the plateau, son. It drops down into that draw for the last 400-500 meters of its flight. And down there, the wind's coming the other way, and it's doing twice the speed. You're not correcting for it. You're correcting into it. Every round you send is getting pushed and then pushed again, and by the time it reaches the steel, it's 1.5 feet off, and you're standing there thinking you're a bad shooter." The corporal stared at him. "You're not a bad shooter," Ethan said. "You're a good shooter reading a bad map." For a long moment, the young man didn't say anything. Then very quietly, almost afraid of the answer, "Who are you?" Ethan looked back out at the canyon. "Just a guy," he said, "who spent a real long time learning to listen." What the corporal didn't know, what none of them knew, what only a handful of living people in the entire world knew, was that the man on the rock had a record, a classified one. The number was sealed so deep that even the men who'd fought beside him only knew it as a rumor. A ghost story whispered in the back of transport planes. A confirmed shot that had ended a high-value target from a distance that the physics people said shouldn't have been possible with the rifle he'd used and the conditions he'd faced. Wind he'd read off the movement of smoke a mile away. A round that had flown for 6 full seconds and dropped through a window the size of a dinner plate. They'd tried to give him a medal for it. He'd asked them not to. He didn't want the record. He didn't want the name. He'd seen what chasing that kind of glory did to men, and he'd wanted none of it. What he'd wanted was to come home. And then, in the same year, they'd tried to pin that medal on him. He'd lost the one person who'd made coming home mean anything. Sarah, his wife. His. He didn't talk about it, couldn't most days. She'd been the steady thing at the center of his violent life, the voice on the phone, the letter in the pack, the reason he'd unloaded his rifle and walked away every single time. And then, a stretch of dark road and a drunk behind the wheel of a truck had taken her while he was 10,000 miles away, doing his country's terrible work, and he hadn't even been able to get home in time to say goodbye. He'd come back to a 2-year-old daughter who didn't understand where her mother went, and a career that suddenly meant nothing at all. So he'd chosen. And it hadn't been a hard choice, not really. He'd put in his papers, cleared out his gear, and become the one thing the legend had never left room for. A dad. A single dad who packed lunches and braided hair badly and sat in tiny chairs at parent-teacher nights and learned slowly, painfully to be soft in a body the government had spent 15 years teaching to be hard. That was the man Colonel Hale had grabbed by the collar and thrown off his mountain. A man who now knew more about diaper rash than most of the fathers in his daughter's class, and who could also, if the wind was right and the cause was worth it, take a life from 1.5 miles away. Both of those things were true. That was the part people could never hold in their heads at the same time. Ethan had made his peace with it. Down on the line, the failures kept coming. Shooter after shooter. Miss after miss. And with every miss, Colonel Hale got louder, meaner, more certain that the problem was the caliber of soldier in front of him, and not the map in his own head. "This is an embarrassment," he was roaring now. "I have a report due to people whose names you're not cleared to know, and I'm going to have to write that the finest snipers in the United States military can't hit a barn door." He was sweating. Ethan could see it even from 20 yards. The kind of sweat that isn't about heat. He's scared, Ethan thought. He's been scared this whole time. That's what all the noise is. A scared man building a wall of other people's shame so nobody notices he's standing on nothing. Ethan had known a lot of men like Hale over the years, and he'd learned something about them that had surprised him. They were never as strong as they sounded. The volume was the tell. The loudest man on any range was always the one with the least underneath. The corporal beside him was still watching the canyon, turning what Ethan had told him over and over in his mind. And finally, the kid said half to himself, "If I dialed for the plateau wind and then corrected back the other way for the draw, doubled it, down low." Ethan almost smiled. "Now you're listening," he said. "Would it work?" "On the right day," Ethan said, "with the right hands. Yeah, it'd work." The corporal looked at him with something like desperation. "Then tell them. Tell the colonel. You could, son." Ethan's voice was gentle, but it stopped the kid cold. "A man who threw me off this mountain isn't going to take a lesson from me in front of 40 people. You can't teach somebody who thinks he's already the smartest man on the hill. All you do is make him meaner." He looked back at the canyon. "The wind'll teach him. It always does. Some men, that's the only teacher they'll accept." The corporal fell silent. And that's when they all heard it. At first, it was just a beat under the wind, a thumping far off coming up the valley. Ethan felt it in his chest before his ears caught up. He knew that sound the way you know a voice you loved. Rotor blades, heavy ones, coming in fast and low the way you fly when you're somebody important and you're in a hurry. On the firing line, the shouting died. 40 heads came up. Colonel Hale turned toward the sound with irritation twisting into something else as the aircraft crested the ridge. Not a training bird, not a supply run, but a sleek command helicopter with markings that made two of the older sergeants stand up very straight. "Who authorized?" Hale started. The helicopter flared and set down hard on the flat behind the line, dust boiling out from under it, and the engine hadn't even spun down before the door slid open and a man stepped out. A big man, silver at the temples, a flight suit with 2 stars on the chest, and the kind of walk that a plateau full of soldiers recognized instantly and instinctively. The walk of a man who did not under any circumstances wait for permission. A JSOC Major General. Colonel Hale's whole body changed. The bluster drained out of him, and something eager and anxious rushed in to fill the space, and he stepped forward with his best command-present smile and his hand half raised in salute. "General, sir, this is an unexpected honor. I wasn't briefed on a..." The general walked straight past him, didn't slow, didn't glance, didn't so much as register that Colonel Marcus Hale existed. He walked past the colonel, past the staff, past the flags and the spotting scopes, and the 40 finest snipers in the country, all of whom had turned to watch, and he walked toward the edge of the range, toward a flat outcrop of rock, toward a middle-aged man in a gray civilian jacket who was at that exact moment rising slowly to his feet. The plateau went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The corporal beside Ethan looked up at him. This quiet man he'd been sitting next to, this thrown-away spectator. This nobody in blue jeans, and watched the 2-star general of Joint Special Operations Command cross 40 yards of open ground to stand in front of him. And then the general stopped, drew himself up to his full height, and did something that broke Colonel Hale's entire world in half. He saluted, crisp, sharp, full of a respect that could not be faked from a man who outranked every single person on that mountain. "Chief Carter," the general said in a voice that carried across the whole silent plateau. "It's an honor to have you back. The country owes you a debt it can never repay." His eyes flicked just once toward the canyon, toward the impossible course, toward the wreckage of the day. "We've got a situation, and you're the only man alive I trust to read it." Ethan Carter returned the salute a little rusty, a little slow, the gesture of a man who'd spent 3 years learning to be a father instead of a weapon. "General Reyes," he said quietly, "and every soldier on that mountain, 40 of the best snipers the United States had ever produced, turned as one to stare at the man Colonel Marcus Hale had grabbed by the collar 6 hours earlier and thrown into the dirt. The colonel stood alone at the center of his own range, his mouth slightly open, the eagles on his shoulders suddenly feeling very, very small. And Ethan Carter looked past the general, past the frozen colonel, out at the canyon that had beaten 40 of America's finest, the canyon he'd read from the very first minute, the canyon that had never stood a chance against a man who knew how to listen. "All right," he said, "show me the targets." General Reyes didn't answer right away. He turned and looked out at the canyon himself, at the wind flags standing nearly limp on the plateau, at the steel targets scattered across the far ridge like teeth, and he let out a slow breath. "Walk with me a second, Chief," he said, "away from the crowd." And that was the moment the whole plateau understood that the world had just turned upside down, because a two-star general had just asked the man in blue jeans for a private word, and had not so much as glanced at the colonel who ran the place. The two of them stepped off toward the edge of the outcrop, and 40 of the best snipers in the United States military stood frozen on the firing line and watched them go. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Colonel Hale, who had a voice for every occasion and an insult for every silence, could not find a single word to fill the enormous quiet that had opened up on his mountain. "Sir." Hale finally managed, taking 2 steps forward. "Sir, if I could just get a briefing on the situation I run this course, I should be part of any." Reyes stopped. He turned his head just enough to look at Hale over his shoulder, and the look on his face was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the flat-tired patience of a man who had already made up his mind about somebody and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "Colonel," Reyes said, "you'll get your briefing when I decide you need one. Right now I need Chief Carter's eyes on that canyon, and I need you to stand where you're standing and let him work." The word chief landed on the plateau like a dropped rifle. Every man there heard it. Chief. Not Mr., not Sir, not civilian. Chief. The men who understood what that word meant in the world Reyes and Carter came from, felt something cold walk up their spines, because there was only one kind of chief who got a SOC general to fly a command bird up a mountain and salute him in front of God and everybody. The corporal who had been sitting beside Ethan on the rock, the one with the open face, whispered it under his breath to the sergeant nearest him. "Chief, he's a SEAL. He's a Navy chief. That's a SEAL sniper." And the sergeant, a hard man with 4 combat tours and a chest full of ribbons, he never talked about, went very still and said, "No, not a SEAL sniper. Look at how Reyes is standing. That's not respect for a rank. That's respect for a person. That man is somebody." By 2:10 in the afternoon, Ethan Carter had walked the whole length of the firing line, once slow hands in his jacket pockets, saying almost nothing. He didn't touch a single rifle. He didn't look at a single scope. He looked at the ground and the grass and the sky and the far ridge and the dust. And once he crouched down and picked up a small handful of dirt and let it sift out of his fingers into the wind, watching which way it went. Then he stood back up and looked at Reyes and said one word. "3. 3 what?" Reyes asked. "3 wins," Ethan said. "Up here on the plateau you've got a nice easy one left to right, maybe 10 miles an hour. That's the one everybody's reading. Halfway down the canyon, there's a second one running crossways faster going the other direction. And down at the bottom, right at the base of that far ridge, where all your targets are, there's a third one that swirls. Comes up off the rock face when the sun hits it. That's the one that's killing them. That's the one nobody up here can even feel." Reyes stared at him. "You got all that from a handful of dirt and a hawk?" Ethan almost smiled. "I got the hawk from the corporal. Kid's got good eyes. He just doesn't know yet what to do with what he sees." He nodded back toward the young man on the rock. "That one. Don't lose him. He's the only shooter on this whole mountain who was asking the right question." Colonel Hale, who had crept close enough to hear, could not stop himself. 3 years of running that course. 3 years of being the loudest and most certain man on the mountain, and a stranger in a gray jacket had just diagnosed his canyon in 90 seconds, standing still. "That's absurd," Hale said. 3 wins. There's no such thing as 3 wins. We measure the wind. We have anemometers, we have flags, we have data. The wind is the wind. If your theory were correct, my instruments would show it." Ethan turned and looked at him for the first time since the general had landed. And there was no triumph in his face, no payback, no "I told you so." Just a strange, quiet sadness, the look of a man watching another man refuse to be helped. "Your instruments are up here, Colonel," Ethan said. "The bullet lives down there. That's the whole problem right there in one sentence. You've been measuring the wrong sky." For a second, Hale had nothing. Then the fear underneath him rose up and turned into meanness the way it always did. "So prove it," Hale said loud now, playing to the 40 men who were all listening. "You've had a lot to say for a man I threw off this range 6 hours ago. General Reyes seems to think you're something special. So put your body behind a rifle and show us. Or is it easier to sit on a rock and criticize?" The whole plateau held its breath, and General Reyes turned to Hale with a look that could have peeled paint. "Colonel, you do not command Chief Carter. You do not challenge Chief Carter. You have no idea who you are talking to." But Ethan lifted a hand gently and stopped him. "It's all right, General." He looked at Hale. "He's got a point in his way. A man shouldn't say a thing he can't do." He paused. "But not yet. My turn's coming. Right now, these men need to shoot, and I need to watch them shoot, because I'm not here to win a bet with a colonel. I'm here to pick a team." That word landed too. A team. Reyes went still. Because Ethan had just said out loud on an open range the thing that was supposed to be classified, and Reyes realized in that instant that Ethan had already figured out exactly why he'd been called 4 days ago off a kitchen floor where his daughter was coloring. "You knew," Reyes said quietly. "I've known since the phone rang," Ethan said. "You don't fly a man like me up a mountain to grade a test. There's a name on somebody's desk, an American, somewhere bad, and you're trying to find the handful of shooters who can pull him out." He looked back at the line of soldiers at all those hard young faces. "So let's find out who they are. Reset the course. I want to watch every one of them fail." It was nearly 2:30 when the shooting started again, and this time, Ethan didn't sit on his rock. He stood at the shoulder of every man who fired. He didn't correct them. That was the strange part, the part the corporal couldn't stop watching. Ethan didn't tell a single one of them how to fix it. He just stood behind them, quiet, watching their hands, watching their breathing, watching the round go down range and sail wide, and then watching most of all what the man did next. What he said. Who he blamed. Whether his shoulders dropped or his jaw set. Whether he cursed the wind or cursed himself. Because Ethan wasn't grading the shot. Reyes understood it a beat later and felt the hair stand up on his arms. Ethan wasn't grading the shot at all. He was grading the man. The first shooter, a big confident staff sergeant from a special missions unit, missed by a foot and slammed his palm on the ground. "This course is rigged," he snarled. "There's no reading that. It's designed to fail." Ethan said nothing. Moved on. But something flickered behind his eyes, and the corporal watching understood that the staff sergeant had just failed a test that had nothing to do with the target. The second shooter, a lean, quiet Marine missed by 10 inches, came up off the rifle and said, "That's on me. I felt something pull it at the last second, and I didn't trust it. I'll trust it next time." Ethan's eyes softened just slightly. He put a hand on the Marine's shoulder for exactly 1 second and said, "Good man," and moved on. The Marine looked like he'd been handed a medal. Colonel Hale watched all of this with growing fury because he could not understand the rules of the game Ethan was playing. In Hale's world, you graded the shot. The shot missed. The man was weak. The man was cut. Simple. Loud. Clean. But this stranger was rewarding a man who missed by 10 inches and ignoring a man who missed by 12, and it made no sense to Hale at all, because Hale had spent his whole career measuring the wrong sky in more ways than one. "You're not even looking at the targets," Hale accused, following Ethan down the line. "Half these shots, you don't even glance downrange. How can you evaluate a shooter if you don't watch the shot?" Ethan stopped, looked at him. "Because I already know they're going to miss, Colonel," he said simply. "Every one of them's going to miss because you never taught them the third wind, because you don't know it exists. So the miss doesn't tell me anything. The miss is just weather." He looked back down the line at all those young men. "What tells me something is what a man does in the 2 seconds after he misses. That's when you see who he really is. That's when the mask comes off. And I have never in my life found a better way to know a man's heart than to watch him fail at something he cares about." The plateau was very quiet, and down at the far end of the line, an old master sergeant with gray in his mustache, a man who had been shooting for 30 years and had said nothing, all day turned to the man next to him and murmured, "In my whole career, I have never heard anybody put it that plain, not once." At 2:45, the 12th shooter stepped up, and the corporal came off the rock and walked toward the line, and Ethan saw him coming and knew what he wanted before the kid said a word. "Chief," the corporal said, and stumbled a little on the word because he'd never called anyone that in his life. "Chief, let me shoot it. I've been thinking about what you said. The 2 wins down low. I want to try it." Hale barked a laugh. "You, Carter, this is the boy who missed by 2 feet this morning. If you want a demonstration of your theories, don't waste it on the worst shooter on the—" "He's not the worst shooter on the mountain," Ethan said, cutting him off, and his voice had gone flat and certain in a way that made even Hale shut his mouth. "He's the only one who asked why. Everybody else asked how. Only this one asked why." He turned to the corporal. "What's your name, son? Your real name?" "Danny," the kid said. "Corporal Daniel Vasquez." "All right, Danny." Ethan crouched down beside him as he settled behind the rifle, and for the first time all day, he coached. Quiet close, just for the kid. "Forget your flags. Forget your dope card. I want you to dial for the plateau wind, first the easy one left to right, just like they taught you. You got it dialed." "Got it," Danny breathed. "Now here's the part nobody up here believes. When your round drops into that draw, it's going to hit a second wind twice as strong, running the other way. So I want you to hold off, not with your scope, with your eye. Hold your reticle a full body width into the wind the wrong way, the way that feels crazy. And then trust it, send it, and don't flinch when your whole body screams that you're about to miss left because you're not. You're going to be dead center. Breathe out and let the mountain do the rest." Danny's hands were shaking. Every man on the plateau had gone silent. Colonel Hale had his arms crossed, waiting, a thin smile already forming for the miss he was certain was coming. "Chief," Danny whispered, "what if I miss?" Ethan put his hand on the young man's back, right between the shoulder blades, the way a father steadies a child on a bicycle the first time he lets go. "Then you missed," Ethan said gently. "And it means nothing about who you are. You already passed the test that matters. This part's just steel." He leaned in a hair closer. "But you're not going to miss, Danny. Breathe. Trust the wind you can't feel. Send it." Danny breathed out. The rifle cracked. And for a second and a half, which is a very long time, the round flew, and the whole plateau watched it in a silence so total you could hear the flags snapping, and Danny's hold looked wrong, looked crazy, looked like a shot that was going to sail a full body width left of everything. And then it dropped into the draw, and something invisible caught it and pushed it, and it came back hard the way Ethan said it would, and it slammed into the center of the 1,000-meter steel with a ringing clang that echoed off the far ridge and rolled back up the canyon like a bell. Nobody moved. The spotter, a young airman, stared through his scope and forgot to call it for a full 3 seconds. Then he said in a voice that cracked, "Hit, center mass. That's a center hit at 1,000 meters." The plateau exploded. 40 of the hardest men in the United States military started yelling and pounding Danny on the back, and Danny came up off that rifle with tears standing in his eyes, and he turned to Ethan, and Ethan just gave him a small nod, one professional to another, and said quietly under all the noise, "See, you could always shoot, son. You were just reading a bad map, same as all of them." And Colonel Marcus Hale stood at the center of the celebration, with his arms still crossed, and his thin smile frozen and dead on his face, because the boy he'd called the worst shooter on the mountain had just done the one thing Hale himself had never once managed to do in 3 years of running that course. He'd read the third wind and hit the steel. That should have been the moment Hale broke. But men like Hale don't break easy because the fear inside them is a bottomless thing, and when the wall of other people's shame comes down, they don't get humble. They get dangerous. Just before 3 o'clock, Hale walked over to General Reyes, and he lowered his voice so the men wouldn't hear, and he made his move. "General," he said, "a word, in private." Reyes looked at him a long moment, then stepped away toward the helicopter with him. "Sir," Hale said, and his voice was oily now, careful, the voice of a man who had climbed a long way up a slick pole by knowing exactly when to be smooth. "I have concerns, serious concerns, about the security of this operation." He glanced back at Ethan. You've brought a civilian onto a classified site. A man with no current clearance, no chain of command, no accountability. He just publicly stated the classified purpose of this exercise in front of 40 personnel. That's a breach, sir. A serious one. And with respect, if this goes sideways, if an American dies because we handed the selection of a rescue team to some retired operator with a grudge and a chip on his shoulder, that's going to land on you, on your career, on your stars. He let that sit. I can protect you from that. I can put my name on the selection, run it through proper channels, keep you clean. All you have to do is let me run my range. It was, Reyes had to admit, a masterful piece of work. It was the exact right poison, aimed at the exact right fear, delivered at the exact right moment. It was the kind of move that had probably worked 100 times in 100 conference rooms across Hale's whole slippery career. And it might even have worked this time if Ethan Carter hadn't been standing 30 feet away. And if Ethan Carter's ears hadn't spent 15 years learning to hear a whisper under a wind. Ethan walked over. Slow. Hands in his pockets. And he stopped a few feet from the two of them, and he looked at Hale, and he said in a voice that was almost kind, "That's a smart play, Colonel. It really is. Point at me, make me the risk, make the general scared of his own stars, so he'll hand you the reins to save himself. I've watched men do that my whole career." He tilted his head. "But you got one thing wrong. You think the general's scared of his stars. He's not. Reyes has thrown away more stars than you'll ever earn to bring men home. That's why he flew up here. That's why he saluted me. You're trying to scare a man with a fear he doesn't have." Hale's jaw tightened. "You were eavesdropping." "I was doing my job," Ethan said, "which is knowing what's happening on a battlefield before it happens. And Colonel, this whole mountain right now is a battlefield. You just don't know which side you're on yet." Reyes looked back and forth between the two of them, and then he settled on Hale, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and final. "Colonel Hale, Chief Carter has more confirmed operational experience than the top 10 men on your range combined. He has a record that you are not and never will be cleared to read. He walked onto your mountain in blue jeans and read a canyon in 90 seconds that has beaten your entire program for 3 years, and you grabbed him by the collar and threw him in the dirt." Reyes let it land. "The only breach of security on this mountain today, Colonel, was your judgment. Now step back and let the man work, or I will have you off this ridge in that helicopter before the next magazine's empty." Hale's face went white, then red, but he stepped back. By 3:15, the sun had shifted and Ethan felt the whole canyon change with it. He felt it the way you feel a room change when someone dangerous walks in. He walked back to the firing line and stood there a moment reading it, and Reyes came up beside him and said quietly, "How many have you found?" "3 so far," Ethan said. "The Marine, the Master Sergeant with the gray mustache, and the kid Danny. Not because they hit. The Marine and the Master Sergeant haven't hit steel all day, but they don't lie about the miss, and they don't blame the wind, and they don't quit, and when the man next to them succeeds, they clap instead of sulk. That's the whole list of things I care about, General. Those are the men who bring a hostage home, not the ones with the tightest groups, the ones who won't leave a friend behind." Reyes was quiet a while. Then he said, "You know we don't have a lot of time, Ethan. The window on this thing is closing. Maybe 36 hours, maybe less." "I know. I need enough shooters to run the plan. I need at least 5 who can make the hard shot when it counts. And so far, you've given me 3 men who can't hit steel." Ethan turned and looked at him. "They can hit steel, General. Every man on this mountain can hit steel. They just don't know the third wind yet." He looked back at the canyon. "So I'm going to teach it to them. All of them. And then we'll see who can shoot it and who can't, and more important, we'll see who helps the man next to him learn it, and who keeps the secret to himself to look good." He almost smiled. "That last part's the real test. You watch. A man who'll teach his rival to shoot better when the mission needs it, even though it means he might not get picked, that's the man I want on the wall, when everything goes to hell at 3 in the morning in a place with no name." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, and something moved across the general's face. Some old grief, some old memory. "You always did see it that way," Reyes said quietly. Even back then. Even when you were the one on the wall. Ethan didn't answer that. Some doors you don't open on a windy ridge in front of 40 men. At 3:30, Ethan gathered every shooter on the mountain into a loose half circle at the edge of the firing line, and Colonel Hale stood at the back with his arms crossed, and Ethan taught them the third wind. He didn't use a whiteboard. He didn't use numbers. He crouched down and picked up a handful of dirt again, and he let it fall, and he told them to watch. And then he told them about the hawk. And then he pointed at the far ridge at the way the heat was coming off the rock face, now that the sun had swung around, and he showed them how to see the swirl at the base, the third wind, the killer, the one nobody up on the plateau could feel. You can't feel it because it's not up here, Ethan said. That's the thing you've got to make peace with today. The most important wind on this whole battlefield is a wind you will never once feel on your own skin. You have to read it in everything else. In the grass on the far ridge. In the dust off the ledges. In the hawk. In the way the mirage boils at the base of the rock. The battlefield doesn't hand you the truth, gentlemen. It hides the truth, and it kills the men who wait to be handed it. You have to go and get it. And the only way to get it is to be humble enough to admit you don't already have it. He stood up. Every one of you missed today, he said. And every one of you thought it meant you weren't good enough. It didn't. It meant nobody ever taught you there were 3 wins instead of 1. That's not your failure. That's a hole in what you were told. And I'm telling you right now on this mountain in front of your colonel that failing at something, because nobody taught you the truth, is not the same as failing because you're weak. Those are 2 different things, and a good leader never ever confuses them. He did not look at Hale when he said it. He didn't have to. Every man there knew exactly who those words were for, and Hale knew it too, and Hale's face was a stone. Now, Ethan said, everybody back on the line, and this time, when the man next to you figures it out, you help the man on the other side of him figure it out too. Because where we might be going, the shot you take isn't going to be the one that saves the day. It's going to be the one your buddy takes when you're reloading, or the one you take to cover him while he pulls a wounded man out of a doorway. You don't rescue anybody alone. So stop shooting like you're alone. And something changed on that plateau. You could feel it. 40 men who had spent the whole day being torn down by a colonel who called them weak suddenly stood a little straighter because a stranger in a gray jacket had just told them the truth. Hale had never told them that they weren't the problem, that they'd been reading a bad map, that the failure they'd been carrying all day didn't belong to them. By 10-4, the whole line was hitting steel. Not all of them, not every shot. But one by one, as they learned to read the third wind as Danny walked the line whispering what he'd learned. To the men who hadn't gotten it yet, the canyon that had beaten 40 of America's finest all day long began at last to give up its targets. The ring of steel came again and again rolling up out of the draw, and every time it did, the men cheered for whoever made the shot. And the man who made the shot turned and taught the next man, and the whole thing built on itself like a fire catching. And Ethan watched. He wasn't watching the hits. He was watching the teaching. He was watching who helped and who hoarded who, lifted the man next to him, and who quietly hoped the man next to him would fail, so he'd look better by comparison. That was the real course. That was the exam nobody knew they were taking. The staff sergeant, the big confident one, who'd slammed his hand on the ground and called the course rigged, figured out the third wind fast and started hitting steel-tight, impressive groups. But he never once turned to help the man beside him. He shot for himself, and he celebrated for himself. And when Danny leaned over to offer him a tip, the staff sergeant waved him off with a sneer. I don't need coaching from the kid who missed by 2 feet this morning. Ethan saw it, wrote nothing down. But Reyes, watching Ethan's face, saw the door close on the staff sergeant, and understood that the best pure shooter on the mountain had just eliminated himself and would never know why. The Marine, the quiet one, still hadn't hit steel by 4 o'clock. He was struggling. Something in his hold, some old habit fighting the new truth. And the master sergeant with the gray mustache, who had finally started ringing steel himself, walked down the line, crouched behind the Marine, and spent 10 full minutes coaching him. Patient, gentle, giving away his own edge to help a man who was technically his competition for a slot on the team. And when the Marine finally rang that steel, the Master Sergeant pounded him on the back like it was his own shot. Ethan turned to Reyes. "There's your fourth and fifth," he said quietly. "The Marine and the Master Sergeant. Not because they can shoot, because of what just happened right there. The old man gave up his own advantage to lift a man who might take his spot, and the Marine didn't quit even when he was the last one on the line still missing." Ethan's voice was rough now, and Reyes noticed it. "That's a man who won't quit on a hostage either. You want to know who'll still be crawling toward the objective when everything's gone wrong, and it's dark and it's cold, and every reason in the world says turn back that man, the one who wouldn't quit on a piece of steel?" Reyes said very quietly, "You're not just picking shooters." "No," Ethan said. "I'm picking men who won't leave somebody behind. Because that's the only kind of man worth sending into a place like the one you're sending them." It was 4:15 when Colonel Hale made his last stand, and it was ugly. He walked out onto the line into the middle of everything, and he raised his voice so all 40 men could hear him, and he pointed at Ethan. "I've watched enough of this," Hale announced. "This man has spent all afternoon undermining my authority, contradicting my training, and filling your heads with mysticism about invisible winds and reading hawks. I've run this course for 3 years. I've forgotten more about long-range shooting than most of you will ever know. And I am telling you as your commanding officer that there is no such thing as a shot that a professionally trained sniper cannot make with proper data and proper discipline. All this talk about heart and humility and not leaving people behind, that's not marksmanship. That's a bedtime story." He rounded on Ethan. "You want these men to respect you, Carter? Then stop hiding behind a general and a classified record nobody can check. Put your own body behind a rifle and make the shot you keep saying is so easy. Or admit that you're exactly what I said you were this morning, a washed-up old man with nothing left but stories." The plateau went dead silent, and for the first time all day, Ethan Carter smiled. A real one, small and tired and almost sad. "You've been waiting all day to say that, haven't you, Colonel?" Ethan said. "You've been standing back there with your arms crossed, just waiting for the moment. And I get it. I do. Because if I miss, you're the man again. Everything goes back to the way it was this morning. You throw me off your mountain, and you write your report, and you tell yourself the boy hit that steel by luck." He nodded slowly. "That's a lot riding on one shot." "Then make it," Hale said. "Or don't." Ethan looked at Reyes. Reyes gave him the smallest nod. And Ethan Carter. Single father, 3 years out of the fight. A man who braided his daughter's hair and packed her lunch and read her stories about brave rabbits every single night, took off his gray jacket, folded it once, and laid it on the rock. Underneath, he was just a man in a plain t-shirt. No ribbons, no rank, no muscle for show, just the quiet economy of a body that had been built for exactly one purpose a long time ago and had never quite forgotten it. "Danny," he said, "bring me your rifle. The one you hit with. I don't want a new one. I want the one that already knows this canyon." Danny scrambled to bring it, cradling it like it was made of glass. And every man on that mountain, 40 of the best snipers in the country, plus one general and one furious colonel, turned to watch the stranger settle down behind the rifle for the first time all day. Ethan didn't rush. That was the thing they all noticed, the thing the Master Sergeant would talk about for the rest of his life. He didn't rush, and he didn't check a dope card, and he didn't dial anything because he wasn't going to use the scope's adjustments at all. He was going to do the whole thing on hold and instinct, the way the old ghosts did it, the way it was done before the electronics, the way a man does it when the wind is changing faster than any dial can keep up. He got behind the rifle. He breathed, and for a long, long moment, he just watched the canyon, and the whole world watched him watch it. "Colonel," he said without looking up, and his voice carried in the silence. "You asked me to make one shot. I'm going to make 3. A pause. The first one's for you, the second one's for these men, and the third one's for me." He settled the rifle deeper into his shoulder. "You want to know why every shooter failed today? It's not the equipment. Your equipment's the finest in the world. It's not the men. Your men are the best this country makes. It's that you can't defeat a battlefield you refuse to understand. The wind doesn't care about your rank. The canyon doesn't read your report. Nature humbles everybody, Colonel, sooner or later. And the only men who survive it are the ones humble enough to learn it. You never learned it. That's your whole story right there. And it's not too late to change it, but it will be if you don't. He breathed out slow. First shot, he said. Left target, 1,200 meters, the one nobody hit all day. And down at the base of the far ridge, the third wind was swirling, boiling off the hot rock. Invisible savage the wind that had beaten 40 men. Ethan read it in the mirage in the grass in a hawk that wasn't even there anymore, but whose flight he remembered. He held off into a wind he could not feel, a full body width, a hold that looked insane to every man watching, a hold that made Colonel Hale's lip curl in anticipation of the miss. He sent it. The round flew for 2 full seconds across the canyon, and the whole plateau stopped breathing. And it looked wrong. It looked like it was going to sail a mile wide, and then it dropped into the draw, and the invisible wind caught it and threw it, and it came screaming back online, and struck the 1,200-meter steel dead center, with a ring so pure and so loud that it rolled up out of the canyon and over the plateau, and seemed to hang in the air. Nobody cheered. It was too much for cheering. 40 men just stared. Ethan was already cycling the bolt. Second shot, he said calmly. Center target, 1,300 meters, downhill angle. The wind just switched. Feel it? No. You don't. That's all right. I do. He held off the other way. This time, the opposite direction. A hold that contradicted the first shot entirely, and Hale actually said out loud, half to himself, "That's wrong. That's the wrong way. He's holding the wrong way." And Reyes said quietly, "He's not." And Ethan sent it. 2.25 seconds. And it rang the 1,300-meter steel dead center, a target so far out that most of the men there hadn't even bothered to range it because they'd assumed it was impossible. Now they cheered. They couldn't help it. It broke out of them like a dam giving way. And Ethan held up one hand and they went quiet again because there was 1 shot left. Third shot, Ethan said, and his voice changed. It got quieter. It got personal. 1,400 meters. The far one. The one your course doesn't even score because nobody's ever hit it. He settled in. This one's mine. And I'm going to tell you why while I do it, because you're going to need to understand it, where you might be going. He breathed. There was a night a long time ago in a place I can't tell you the name of where I had to make a shot like this one, he said, and the whole plateau went utterly still because they all knew without being told that they were about to hear a piece of the classified record no report would ever hold. There was a man pinned down, one of ours. And between me and the men who were going to kill him there was 1,400 meters of bad wind and 6 seconds of bullet flight and no room at all to be wrong. And I remember lying there thinking, this is impossible, nobody makes this shot. His finger settled on the trigger. And then I thought about the man on the other end. And I thought, he's not asking me to make a possible shot. He's asking me to make the one that gets him home to his family. And the wind got real quiet, gentlemen. The way it always does when the thing you're doing matters more than you do. He breathed out all the way to that still and empty place at the bottom of the breath. That's the secret, he said. That's the whole thing. You don't make the impossible shot for yourself. You make it for the man waiting on the other end. Aim past your own life, and the wind gets quiet. And he sent the third round across the canyon. 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds any man on that mountain had ever lived through. The round flew out over the draw into the killing wind, holding off in a way that no data would ever have told him to hold. And it dropped, and it rose, and it fought. And it came home, and it struck the 1,400-meter steel, the target nobody had ever hit. The one the course didn't even score, dead in the center, with a ring that came rolling back up out of that canyon like the mountain itself had finally decided to speak. For a full 3 seconds, absolute silence. Then 40 of the best snipers in the United States military erupted, and the sound of it went up off that ridge and into the sky, and grown men who'd seen things that don't leave a person were pounding each other on the back with tears in their eyes. And Danny Vasquez was just standing there with both hands on top of his head saying, oh my God, over and over. And Ethan Carter got up off the rifle, slow, the way a much older man gets up, and he handed it back to Danny, and he picked up his gray jacket off the rock and put it back on, becoming again the quiet middle-aged man in street clothes that Colonel Hale had thrown in the dirt that morning. He walked back toward Reyes, and he passed close by Hale on the way, and he stopped for just a second, and he said low, so only the colonel could hear it. "It's still not too late, Marcus, to learn it, any of it. It's the only thing I'm actually here to teach." But Colonel Marcus Hale stood at the center of his own collapsed authority, on a mountain that no longer belonged to him, in front of 40 men who would never again fear his voice, and he could not hear it. Because a man who has spent his whole life being the loudest thing on the hill cannot hear a whisper, even one meant to save him. Ethan looked at him one moment longer, and there was that sadness again, that terrible patience, the look of a man watching another man refuse the only thing that could have set him free. Then he turned away and walked to the general, and behind him the steel was still faintly ringing in the canyon, and the sun was starting at last to slide down toward the far ridge. And General Reyes looked at the man in the gray jacket and said quietly, so no one else could hear the 5 words that changed everything. "Ethan, it's her father. The hostage. It's Danny's father." And Ethan Carter went very, very still. For a long moment, Ethan didn't say anything at all. The steel was still ringing faint in the canyon, and 40 men were still celebrating behind him, and the sun was sliding down toward the far ridge, and none of them knew that the whole world had just tilted under 2 men standing quietly by a helicopter. "Say that again," Ethan said, very low. "The hostage," Reyes said. "The American we're going in for. His name is Master Sergeant Raymond Vasquez, retired. He went back over as a civilian contractor, training local forces, doing good work, keeping his head down." Reyes swallowed. "He's Danny's father, Ethan. That corporal you've been coaching all day. The kid who hit the 3rd wind. That's his boy." Ethan turned his head and looked back down the line, and there was Danny, 23 years old, still standing with his hands on top of his head, grinning like it was the best day of his life, pounding fists with the men who 6 hours ago wouldn't have known his name. A kid who had no idea. A kid who thought he'd just aced a hard course and impressed a legend. A kid who did not know that on the other side of the world, in a place with no name, his father was on his knees in the dark waiting to find out if anyone was coming. "Does he know?" Ethan asked. "No. And he can't. Not yet." Reyes's jaw was tight. "Ethan, I didn't put that together until an hour ago myself. The names came through the intel package on the flight up. Vasquez is a common name. Nobody flagged it. And then I landed and I heard you call that corporal by his name, and I about had a heart attack because the man we're trying to pull out of a hole in the ground has the exact same last name, and I ran it, and it's not a coincidence." He looked at Ethan with something close to desperation. "The father went missing 4 days ago. 4 days ago, Ethan. The same day I called you off your kitchen floor. And his son has been on this mountain the whole time getting screamed at by Marcus Hale, and nobody told him his father was gone." Ethan Carter had faced a lot of impossible things in his life. He'd made shots that physics said couldn't be made. He'd carried men off battlefields with his own body failing. He'd buried a wife and raised a daughter who used to cry for a mother she couldn't remember. He'd thought he knew every shape that impossible could take. But standing on that ridge, looking at a boy who was happy, a boy who had no idea, was a new one. And for a second, just a second, the legendary sniper who read the wind off a hawk's wing didn't know what to do. 4 days, Ethan repeated. "How long's he got Ray?" Reyes didn't answer right away, and that told Ethan everything. "Ray, how long?" "The intel says they're moving him tomorrow night," Reyes said quietly. "To a facility we can't reach. Once he's inside that facility, he's gone. We won't get another window. So we've got one shot, tomorrow, before they move him." He looked at his watch, and Ethan watched him do it. Watched the general's hand shake just slightly. "It's 4:30 in the afternoon here. The window on the other side of the world opens in about 30 hours. We fly the team out tonight, which means I need a team named in the next hour, geared and briefed by midnight, and wheels up before dawn." He looked at Ethan. "And I need to know whether the boy goes." And there it was. The impossible thing under the impossible thing. Because Danny Vasquez was by any measure one of the finest young shooters Ethan had seen all day, a natural, the only man on the mountain who'd asked the right question. If Ethan was building the best team he could to pull a man out of a hole, Danny belonged on it. He'd earned it. He'd earned it fair. But the man in the hole was Danny's father. And there is no colder truth in that whole terrible profession than this one: you do not put a man on the team that's rescuing his own family. Because a man will do things to save his father that will get everybody killed. He'll break formation. He'll take the shot he shouldn't. He'll run into the room he was told to cover. Love makes a man brave, and love makes a man stupid, and on an objective, stupid gets people killed. You want me to tell him? Ethan said slowly. Or you want me to keep him off the team without telling him why? I don't know, Reyes admitted, and it was the first time all day the general had sounded lost. That's why I'm telling you and not deciding it myself. You've spent all day reading these men's hearts. You tell me, does that boy go home tonight not knowing his father's alive or dead, and find out later whether we brought him back? Or does he stand in that briefing room and hear that his dad is on his knees in the dark, and then get told he's not allowed to be one of the men who goes to get him? Reyes shook his head slowly. I've sent men to die, Ethan. I've written the letters, but I don't know which of those two things is crueler, and I need a man who reads people better than I do to tell me. Ethan looked out of the canyon a long time. The wind was dying with the day, the way it always did when the sun came down off the rock and the air stopped fighting itself. He'd read 1,000 winds in his life. This was the first time in 3 years he'd had to read a man's whole future in one, and one of them was a boy who'd just had the best day of his life. There's a third choice, Ethan said finally. What third choice? You're asking whether the boy goes or whether the boy stays, Ethan said. You framed it as 2 doors, but you're leaving out the only door that matters. He turned and looked at Reyes. You tell him the truth. You tell him his father's alive, that we know where he is, that we're going to get him. And then you let him decide with his eyes open whether he's steady enough to go. You don't decide it for him in the dark. You put the whole terrible thing in his hands, and you watch what he does with it. Ethan's voice was quiet and certain now. Because that's the exact test, Ray. That's the same test I've been running all day. Can a man hold something that matters more than his own life and still keep his hands steady? Some men can, most can't. And the only way to find out which one Danny is to hand it to him and watch. Reyes stared at him. And if he can't hold it, if he breaks, then he stays. Ethan said. And we both know before we ever leave the ground, instead of finding out at 1,400 meters with his father's life on the line. Better he breaks here on this mountain, where the only thing that shatters is his heart, than over there, where it's everybody's lives. He looked back at the boy. But I've watched that kid all day, General. I watched him get called the worst shooter on the mountain and not quit. I watched him wander over and sit next to the one man everybody else was avoiding because he wanted to learn more than he wanted to look good. I watched him hit a shot nobody thought he could hit, and then walk the whole line, giving away what he learned to every man who'd listen when he could have kept it to himself and looked like a genius. Ethan's voice softened. That's not a boy who breaks Ray. That's a boy who's about to find out what he's made of. And I think it's more than any of us know, including him. It was 4:45 when Reyes made the call. He nodded once, slow the way a man nods when he's decided to do the hard right thing instead of the easy wrong one. Bring him, Reyes said. Just him, to the far side of the bird away from the others. I'll tell him myself. It should come from me. I'm the one sending men to get his father. No, Ethan said quietly. It should come from both of us. You tell him the mission. I'll tell him the rest. Because after you tell him his father's alive, somebody's going to have to catch him. And I've caught more falling men than you have, General, with respect. Reyes looked at him a long moment, and then something in his face broke open some old thing, and he said very quietly, God, I missed working with you, Ethan. 15 years and you still see the whole board. You always did. He cleared his throat hard, and the general came back over the man. All right, get him. Ethan walked down the line, and as he came, the celebration quieted, the way a room quiets when everyone senses without knowing why that something important is about to happen. Men stepped back, and Ethan stopped in front of Danny Vasquez, and the boy looked up at him with his whole open young face still lit up from the shot he'd made, and he said, "Chief, I've never seen anything like those 3 shots, that last one. I don't even have words. That was the greatest thing I've ever—" "Danny," Ethan said gently, "walk with me a second. The general wants a word with you." And the light in the boy's face flickered just slightly, the first shadow of understanding that something was wrong. The animal instinct all humans have that knows before the mind does. "With me," he said. Is everything okay? Did I do something?" "You didn't do anything," Ethan said, and put a hand on his shoulder and steered him gently away from the others, toward the far side of the helicopter where Reyes was waiting. "Come on, son. Walk with me." They stood on the far side of the bird, the 3 of them out of earshot of the 40 men who were all now watching from a distance, silent, feeling the weight of it, without knowing what it was. Reyes looked at the boy for a moment. This young corporal standing at a loose, nervous attention in front of a 2-star general, and Ethan watched the general gather himself to do one of the hardest things a commander ever does. "Corporal Vasquez," Reyes said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, sir," Danny said, but his voice had gone thin. "Your father is Master Sergeant Raymond Vasquez, retired." "Correct." And Ethan watched the boy's whole world change in the space between 2 heartbeats. Watched the color go out of his face. Watched his hands, which had been so steady on that rifle an hour ago, start to tremble at his sides. "Sir," Danny whispered. "Sir, is my dad what happened to my dad?" "Your father is alive," Reyes said, fast, getting the most important word out first because he'd told enough men enough terrible things to know you lead with the one thing they can hold on to. "He's alive, Danny. Look at me. He is alive. Do you hear me?" Danny nodded, but his eyes had gone glassy and far away, and Ethan stepped in a half-step closer, ready. "4 days ago, your father was taken," Reyes said. "He went back over as a civilian training local forces. He was doing good work. And a group grabbed him, and they're holding him, and we know where. That's the good news, son. We know exactly where he is. And that operation we've all been dancing around today, the reason I flew up this mountain, the reason Chief Carter is here, the reason you've all been shooting that impossible course, it's for him. It was always for him. We're going in to bring your father home." And that was the moment Danny Vasquez's knees went. Ethan caught him, just like he said he would. Got an arm around him and held him up, this boy who an hour ago had been on top of the world, and Danny grabbed a fistful of Ethan's gray jacket and held on like a drowning man, and the sound that came out of him wasn't a word, it was just a sound. The sound a son makes when he learns the man who taught him to ride a bike is on his knees in the dark on the other side of the world. "I've got you," Ethan said quietly right in his ear, holding him up. "I've got you, Danny. Breathe. I've got you." It took the boy a full minute to come back. Ethan held him the whole time, and Reyes stood watch, and 40 men waited at a distance in a silence you could have cut with a knife. And slowly, Danny got his feet back under him and got his breath back and pushed himself upright and wiped his face hard with the back of his hand. "How long?" Danny said, and his voice was wrecked, but it was steady, and Ethan noticed it and marked it. "How long has he got? Tell me the truth. Don't handle me. How long?" Reyes looked at Ethan. Ethan gave the smallest nod. "Tell him the truth. All of it." "They move him tomorrow night," Reyes said, "to a place we can't reach. Once he's inside, we lose him for good. So we go tomorrow. We fly out tonight. And that means the team gets named in the next hour." And Ethan watched the boy do the math. Watched him understand it. Watched the exact moment Danny Vasquez realized that the mission to save his father was leaving tonight, and that he was one of the best shooters on the mountain, and that in about 30 hours, somebody was going to have to make a 1,400-meter shot in bad wind to keep his father alive, and that he could be one of the men who did it. "I want to go," Danny said instantly. "Chief, General, sir, I want to go. I'm one of the best shooters here. You saw it. I hit the 3rd wind. I can make that shot. Please, that's my dad. You have to let me." And there it was. The exact thing Ethan had known would come. The love that makes a man brave, and the love that makes a man stupid. Both of them at once pouring out of a 23-year-old boy who'd just been handed the worst news of his life, and the one chance to do something about it in the same breath. "Danny," Ethan said. And he didn't say no. That was the thing Reyes noticed, the thing that made the general understand all over again why he'd flown up that mountain for this particular man. Ethan didn't say no. He said the boy's name gently, and waited until the boy was looking at him. "I want you to listen to me now the same way you listened to me on that rock," Ethan said. "Real careful. Because this is the most important thing I'm going to teach you all day, and it's got nothing to do with wind." Danny went still. "There's a reason we don't send a man to rescue his own father," Ethan said. His voice was low and even and kind, but there was iron under it. "And it's not because we doubt him. It's not because we think he's weak. It's the opposite. It's because we know he loves too much to be safe." He put both hands on the boy's shoulders. "When you get out there and it's dark and it's going wrong, and you see your father through a scope on his knees, something's going to happen inside you that you can't train for and you can't stop. Every cell in your body is going to scream, 'Run to him.' And you'll break your position to do it. You'll take a shot you shouldn't take. You'll cross a line of fire you were told to stay behind. And Danny, it won't just be you that dies when you do that. It'll be the men on either side of you. It'll be the whole team. And maybe it'll be your father, because the rescue falls apart. The second one man on it stops thinking about the mission and starts thinking about the person." Danny's eyes were streaming now, but he was listening. He was listening the way he'd listened on the rock. "So here's what I need you to do," Ethan said. "And it's the hardest thing anybody's ever going to ask you to do, and it's harder than any shot. I need you to be the man who loves his father enough to stay home." He tightened his grip on the boy's shoulders. "I need you to trust me, and these men to go get him, and I need you to be here safe alive, so that when we bring him back he's got a son to come home to. Because Danny, if you come with us and something happens to you, then even if we get him out, we hand your father a rescue that cost him his boy. And I have looked into the eyes of a man who got saved at the cost of his own child's son, and I am telling you that man does not thank you. That man never sleeps again." The whole plateau was silent. Reyes had stopped breathing. "I know that's not fair," Ethan said softer now. "I know it's the cruelest thing in the world to be the best shooter on this mountain and be told to stay home while other men go save your dad. I know it feels like cowardice, even though it's the bravest thing you'll ever do. But I'm not asking you as a colonel asks a Corporal Danny. I'm asking you as one father to a son." His voice cracked, just slightly, and Reyes heard it and understood that Ethan was thinking about a little girl with a paper star clipped to a sun visor. "I've got a daughter waiting at home for me right now, 6 years old. And the only reason I can do what I'm about to do, the only reason my hands stay steady out there, is that I know somebody I trust is keeping her safe while I'm gone. That's the job I'm giving you. Not the easy one. The impossible one. Stay alive. Stay whole. Be the thing your father comes home to." For a long time, Danny didn't say anything. He stood there with the tears running down his face and his jaw working, and Ethan let him have the silence, because some decisions can't be rushed, and this was the biggest one the boy would ever make. And then Danny Vasquez did the thing that told Ethan everything. The thing that Reyes would remember for the rest of his career. The thing that separated the men who bring people home from the men who just want to be heroes. He nodded. "Okay," Danny whispered. "Okay, Chief. I'll stay." He wiped his face again hard and stood up straighter and looked Ethan dead in the eye and said the words that made the legendary sniper's throat go tight. "But you bring him home. You look at me right now and you promise me you bring my dad home." And Ethan Carter, who had spent a lifetime never making a promise he couldn't keep, who had learned the hard way that a promise broken is worse than one never made, who had stood at a graveside 3 years ago and understood that some things are outside any man's power to promise, looked the boy in the eye. "I can't promise you he lives," Ethan said quietly, because he would not lie to this boy, Not even to comfort him, not even now. No honest man can promise you that, and you'd never trust me again if I did, because you'd know it was a lie. But I can promise you this, Danny, and I've never broken a promise in my life. I promise you that every single man who goes out there tomorrow is going to fight for your father like he's their own. I promise you, nobody's leaving without him if there's any way on God's earth to get him out. And I promise you that if it comes down to one shot 1,400 meters bad wind, no room to be wrong, the man taking that shot is going to be me. And I have made that shot before, son. For a stranger. Imagine what I'll do when it's your dad. And Danny Vasquez, 23 years old, broke down completely and grabbed the old sniper and held on, and Ethan held him. And over the boy's shoulder, Reyes had to look away and blink hard and pretend to check his watch, because a two-star general does not cry on a mountaintop in front of 40 men, no matter how much he might want to. It was 5 o'clock when they walked back toward the line, and the 40 men had understood somehow, without a word being spoken, that whatever had happened on the far side of that helicopter had been enormous. And when Danny walked back red-eyed but upright, the master sergeant with the gray mustache stepped forward, and he didn't ask what happened. He just put a hand on the boy's shoulder, and Danny nodded at him, and that was all. Men who do that kind of work have a whole language that doesn't use words. Reyes stepped up onto the low rise at the head of the line, and the 40 men came to attention, and even Colonel Hale off to the side straightened up out of pure reflex. In 1 hour, Reyes said, "I'm going to name a team. Some of you are going to be on it. Most of you aren't. And the ones who aren't, I need you to understand something right now tonight before you find out." He paused, and his eyes moved across all of them. "You were not selected on marksmanship. Every man here can shoot. That's why you're here. The men who go tomorrow aren't going because they're the best shots on this mountain. They're going because of something Chief Carter's been watching all day that most of you didn't even know was being watched." He looked at Ethan. "Chief, you want to tell them, or should I?" Ethan stepped up, and 40 of the best snipers in the country looked at the man in the gray jacket, the man half of them had watched get thrown in the dirt that morning. The man all of them had watched ring 3 impossible targets an hour ago, and there was not one of them now who didn't lean in to hear what he had to say. "I didn't watch a single one of your shots today," Ethan said. "Not really. I watched what you did after the shot. I watched who blamed the wind and who owned the miss. I watched who sulked when the man next to him succeeded and who clapped. I watched who kept what he learned to himself to look good and who turned around and taught it to the man beside him, even though it might cost him his own spot on the team." He let that land. "Because where we're going, the shot you take doesn't save the day. The shot your buddy takes when you're reloading, that saves the day. The cover you give a man while he drags a wounded father out of a doorway, that saves the day. You don't rescue anybody alone. And a team full of the best individual shooters in the world, if every one of them is only thinking about himself, will get a hostage killed faster than a team of average men who die for each other." He looked down the line, slow meeting eyes. "The men I picked today aren't the tightest groups," he said. "Some of them didn't ring steel until the very end. I picked them because when the man next to them was drowning, they reached out a hand instead of stepping on his head to look taller. That's the whole test. That was always the whole test. And every one of you who figured that out on your own today, without being told, without knowing it, counted you already know who you are." And that was when Colonel Hale, who had been silent for almost an hour, who had watched his authority collapse, and his mountain change hands, and his worst shooter become the emotional center of the whole day, made the last mistake of his career. Because a man like Hale cannot stand to be irrelevant. He would rather be hated than unseen. And so he stepped forward into the space at the head of the line that belonged now to other men, and he raised his voice one final time. "This is all very moving," Hale said. "Very inspirational. Heart and humility in teaching your buddy to shoot. It'll make a wonderful speech someday." His voice curdled. "But we are about to send men into hostile territory to pull out a hostage, and I have sat here all day and watched a retired operator with a personal savior complex select a team based on who has the best feelings. Feelings general, not scores, not qualifications. Feelings." He turned to the men. "When you're pinned down in a hole tomorrow night, and the man next to you can't make the shot because Chief Carter picked him for his warm heart instead of his cold hands, you remember this moment. You remember that I stood here and told you that war is won by the man who hits the target, not the man who hugs his neighbor. And the plateau went very still, and Ethan Carter turned and looked at Colonel Marcus Hale one last time, and there was no anger in his face, and no sadness anymore either. There was just a terrible final clarity, the look of a man who has given someone every chance to be saved and watched them refuse every one. "Colonel," Ethan said quietly, "you want to know the difference between you and every man on this line." Hale said nothing. "An hour ago I told them a story," Ethan said, "about a shot I made a long time ago. 1,400 meters bad wind, a man pinned down. And I told them the shot got quiet when I stopped thinking about myself and started thinking about the man on the other end." He took a step toward Hale. "That man on the other end, Colonel. The one I saved that night. The reason I made the impossible shot." He paused. "His name was Raymond Vasquez. Master Sergeant Raymond Vasquez." And the whole plateau made a single sharp intake of breath from 40 men at once, because they'd all just heard the general say that name an hour ago, and Danny Vasquez went white as a sheet and grabbed the arm of the master sergeant beside him. "That's right," Ethan said, and his voice never rose, and that was somehow worse than any shout. "The man we're flying across the world to rescue tomorrow is the same man I pulled out of a fire with an impossible shot 15 years ago. His son has been standing on your mountain for 4 days while you called him weak. And the reason I'm going back tomorrow, the reason a man who braids his daughter's hair and reads her stories about brave rabbits is going to pick up a rifle one more time, is that Ray Vasquez has a boy right here on this line, and I made that boy a promise 10 minutes ago." Another step. "That's the heart you've been sneering at all day, Colonel. That's the warm feeling you think loses wars. It's the only thing in this entire world that has ever brought a single hostage home alive. Not your data, not your scores, not your volume. A man who cares enough about somebody else to make a shot that's impossible." He turned his back on Hale, then deliberately, completely, the way you turn away from something that is finished, and he looked at Reyes. "General," he said, "I've got your team, 5 men. I'll give you their names inside." He glanced at his watch. "It's 5:15. You said wheels up before dawn. That doesn't leave much time, and there's a boy on this line who needs to call his mother tonight, and there's a promise I need to keep. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to stop talking now and start getting my men ready to bring Ray Vasquez home." And Reyes looked at the man in the gray jacket. The single father. The legend. The ghost. The chief. Standing on a mountain in the falling light, with the steel gone quiet in the canyon behind him, and 40 of the best men in the country ready to follow him anywhere. "Yeah, Chief," Reyes said quietly. "Let's bring him home." The 5 names Ethan gave Reyes inside the helicopter were not the 5 names anyone on that mountain would have predicted at 8 o'clock that morning. The staff sergeant with the tightest groups on the range, the man who'd wrung more steel than anybody once he cracked the third wind, was not on the list. And when Reyes read the names back and got to the end and looked up, he said, "You're leaving off your best pure shooter, Ethan. You know that." "I know exactly who I'm leaving off," Ethan said. "And I know why." "Tell me why." "Because when this is over and there's a review, I'm going to have to explain to people in a building with no windows why I sent a Marine who missed all day and left home a man who could put 5 rounds in a teacup at 1,000 meters. Ethan was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You remember when Danny leaned over to give that staff sergeant a tip this afternoon, just trying to help, and the sergeant waved him off and said he didn't need coaching from the kid who missed by 2 feet? I remember. That's why," Ethan said simply. "A man who won't take help from someone beneath him won't give help to someone beneath him either. And out there, Ray Vasquez is going to be the most beneath him man in the world. Broken, weak, maybe can't walk, maybe crying, dead weight in a doorway with rounds coming in." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I need men who'll pick up dead weight and carry it and love it while they do. That staff sergeant would make the shot, Ray. I don't doubt it for a second. And then he'd stand over a man who couldn't move fast enough and he'd resent him for it. and in the half-second that resentment lives in his chest, somebody dies. He looked at the general. I'm not leaving off my best shooter. I'm leaving off a man who's never once in his life picked up something beneath him and carried it like it mattered. And that's the only skill this mission actually needs. Reyes looked at the list a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket over his heart and said, "That's going in the after-action word for word. Because that's the truest thing anybody's said about this business in 20 years." It was 5:30 when they came back out of the helicopter, and the light was going golden long across the plateau, and the 40 men were waiting, and Reyes climbed the low rise one more time and read the 5 names. The Marine, the Master Sergeant with the gray mustache, and 3 others Ethan had marked through the long afternoon, 3 men who had one thing in common that had nothing to do with a scope. Every one of them at some point during the day, when he thought no one was watching, had reached out and lifted a man who was falling. And here is the thing that told Ethan he'd chosen right. The thing that made the whole terrible day worth it. When Reyes read those 5 names, the 35 men who were not on the list did not sulk. They did not grumble. Because Ethan had spent the last hour teaching them what the test really was, and every one of them now understood in his bones that the men going out tomorrow were going because they were the kind of men you'd want coming for you if it was your father in that hole. And you cannot be jealous of that. You can only be proud to have stood next to it. The staff sergeant, the best pure shooter, the one Ethan had cut, stepped forward out of the ranks. And for a second, Ethan thought he was going to make a scene, make it ugly the way Hale would have. And the whole line tensed. But the staff sergeant walked up to the 5 men, and he stopped in front of the Marine, the quiet one who'd missed all day, and he stuck out his hand. "I gave you a hard time this afternoon." The staff sergeant set his jaw tight. "When you couldn't hit steel, I want to take it back before you go." He swallowed. "Bring him home. Do the thing I'm apparently not good enough to do." And the Marine took his hand and shook it, and something passed between them, and Ethan watched it happen and thought, there it is. That's the man growing right there in front of me. Maybe I cut him too soon. Maybe by the next mission he's the first man I pick. Because the test was never whether you were born with a good heart. It was whether you were willing to grow one, and that man just grew one in public in the space of an afternoon. Ethan filed it away. He never forgot a man who changed. By 5:45, the mission clock was running hard, and Reyes had the 5 selected men pulled aside for the first layer of the brief, and the 35. Others were breaking down the range, and the whole mountain had shifted from a competition into something graver and quieter. The particular hush that settles over men who know that some of them are about to fly toward a place with no name. And that was when Colonel Marcus Hale did the last thing anyone expected, the thing that would end his career. Not with a bang, but with the slow, complete collapse of everything he'd built his life on. He came looking for Reyes. And he was not oily this time, and he was not smooth, and the command presence was cracking around the edges, because a man who has watched his entire authority evaporate in a single afternoon starts at last to feel the ground giving way under him. He came up to the general fast, and he said low and urgent, "General, a word, now, before this goes any further." Reyes turned. "Colonel, I'm running a mission clock. Whatever it is, make it fast." "You cannot send this team," Hale said. "I've reviewed the selections. It's malpractice. You've got a Marine who couldn't hit a target all day. You've got a Master Sergeant who's 51 years old and should have retired a decade ago. And you left off the finest marksman on this mountain because a retired sailor didn't like the look in his eye." Hale's voice was rising, cracking. "When this fails, and it will fail, it's going to come back on both of us. But I'm putting it on record right now in front of witnesses that I objected. I formally objected. So that when a hostage dies because of Carter's, his feelings-based selection, the blame lands where it belongs. On him. And on you for letting him." And Ethan, standing a few feet away with the 5 men, heard every word. And he turned around slow. "Colonel," Ethan said, "you keep saying that word, feelings, like it's a weakness, like it's the opposite of being a professional." He walked over. "You want to know the most professional thing I ever saw a man do? I saw a soldier pinned down out of ammo with a wounded man he couldn't carry and couldn't leave. And that soldier had a choice. Save himself live, go home to his family. or stay and probably die with a man he barely knew. Ethan's voice was very quiet. He stayed. And it wasn't training that made him stay. Training tells you to preserve the force. It wasn't orders. His orders were to fall back. It was feeling Colonel. It was the exact thing you've spent all day sneering at. He stayed because he could not live in a world where he'd left that man to die. And I know he stayed because I was 1,400 meters away, and the wounded man he wouldn't leave was named Ray Vasquez, and the soldier who stayed was the reason I had a target still breathing to shoot for. The plateau had gone silent again. Every hostage that's ever come home, Ethan said, came home because somewhere in the chain there was a man who felt too much to quit. You call it a weakness. It's the only strength that has ever mattered in the work you and I supposedly do. And the fact that you've spent 30 years in this business and never learned that Colonel is not a badge of toughness. It's the saddest thing I've seen all day. But Hale was past hearing it now. Fear had him fully the cornered animal fear of a man who feels his whole identity coming apart, and he did the thing that finally truly finished him. He turned to Reyes, and he played his last card, and it was a filthy one. General, Hale said, I'm formally requesting that Chief Carter be removed from any operational role in this mission, on the grounds that he is compromised. He pointed at Ethan. He has a personal relationship with the hostage. He just admitted it in front of everyone. He saved this man before. He's got a bond with the family. He made a promise to the son 10 minutes ago. I heard about it. That is the textbook definition of a compromised operator. You said it yourself this morning, sir. Indirectly, we don't send men to rescue their own. Well, this man might as well be family. His judgment is shot. He'll take risks he shouldn't. He'll get your team killed trying to keep a promise to a boy. Hale's eyes were bright and desperate. By your own logic, General, by the exact standard you'd apply to that Corporal Carter can't go. He's too close. Remove him. And it was Ethan had to admit a genuinely clever trap. Because it was true. Every word of it was structurally true. Ethan was close to this. He had a bond with Vasquez. He'd made a promise to the boy. By the cold logic of the profession, the same logic Ethan himself had used an hour ago to keep Danny home. Ethan Carter was exactly the kind of compromised operator you don't send. Reyes turned and looked at Ethan, and for the first time there was real uncertainty in the general's face because Hale had done the one thing that could actually work. He'd used Ethan's own wisdom against him. The whole plateau waited, and Ethan Carter smiled slow and sad. He's right, Ethan said. Reyes blinked. Ethan, no, General, he's right, and I want you to hear me say it because it matters that you hear me say it. Ethan turned to face all of them. There's a rule. We don't send a man to rescue his own family because love makes him unsafe. I told that exact thing to that boy an hour ago, and I meant every word. And Colonel Hale's right that by that rule I shouldn't go either. Ray Vasquez is family to me, closer than family. You share a moment like the one he and I shared 15 years ago, and it's a bond that goes past blood. He nodded. So the Colonel's caught me in my own rule, fair and square, and Hale for one shining second thought he'd won. But here's what the Colonel doesn't understand about the rule. Ethan went on, and his voice dropped into something deep and certain and final. Because he's never understood the difference between the letter of a thing and the heart of it, and that's been his whole problem from the first minute I set foot on this mountain. The rule isn't, don't send a man who loves the hostage. The rule is, don't send a man whose love will make his hands shake. He held up one hand steady, as stone dead level in the golden light. And the thing you have to understand about me, Colonel? The thing my whole classified record is really about the reason a general flew up a mountain to salute a man in blue jeans is that I am the one man alive whose hands get steadier the more it matters. You've got it exactly backwards. For most men, love is the thing that ruins the shot. For me, it's the only thing that's ever made it possible. I told you an hour ago, the wind gets quiet when you stop shooting for yourself and start shooting for the man on the other end. That's not a weakness in me, Colonel. That's the whole gift. That's the thing you can't teach and can't buy and can't measure with your instruments. And it's the exact reason I'm the man for this, and you never could be." He lowered the hand. "Danny stays home because his love would shake his hands," Ethan said quietly. "I go because mine won't. That's not me breaking my own rule, Colonel. That's me being the one exception the rule was always waiting for. And the difference between us, the whole difference, 30 years of it, is that you'd never in 1,000 years be able to tell those two things apart." Reyes let out a breath he'd been holding, and something in the general's shoulders came down, and he turned to Hale, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, and it was the end of everything. "Colonel Hale," Reyes said, "you've objected twice now. Once on security, once on the chief's fitness. I've heard you both times, and I want to be very clear so there's no confusion later when the people in the windowless building ask me what happened on this mountain today." He stepped closer. "The reason I flew up here is that 4 days ago, a good man got taken, and I needed the one operator on Earth I trust to bring him back. And the one operator I trust is standing next to you in a gray jacket. You threw him in the dirt this morning. You called him a has-been. You tried to scare me with my own stars, and when that failed, you tried to have him removed with his own wisdom. And both times you were doing the same thing you've been doing for 30 years, which is protecting yourself and calling it protecting the mission." Reyes's voice never rose, and that was what made it terrible. "I've watched commanders like you my whole career, Marcus, and the difference between you and a real leader isn't courage, and it isn't skill, and it isn't even the ego. God knows we've all got ego. It's that when the moment came to put somebody else first, you couldn't do it. Not once. Not all day. Every single move you made was about you. And that is the one thing I cannot have anywhere near an operation to save a father's life." Reyes turned to his aide, who had come off the helicopter and was standing by with a secure phone. "Get me the training command," Reyes said loud enough for the whole plateau to hear it. "Colonel Hale is relieved of command of this course effective immediately pending review. I want him off this ridge on the next bird out, and I want a full audit of this qualification program going back 3 years, because I've got 40 of the finest snipers in this country who've been failing a course that its own commander never cracked. And I've got a real strong feeling we're going to find out he's been blaming these men for a hole in his own understanding since the day he took over." And that was how it ended for Colonel Marcus Hale. Not with a shout, not with a fistfight, not even with Ethan Carter humiliating him, though every man there would have understood if he had. It ended with a general saying quietly that a man who could not put anyone ahead of himself was not fit to lead men who might have to die for each other. It ended with the audit that would eventually show that the third wind had been beating that course since the day Hale took it over, and that he'd written 36 qualified snipers as failures, rather than admit there was a sky he didn't understand. Hale stood there. And for just a moment, one moment, something moved behind his eyes, some flicker of the man he might have been if he'd ever once in 30 years been brave enough to say, "I don't know, teach me." And Ethan saw it. Ethan, who saw everything, saw the ghost of the good soldier trapped inside the frightened one. And Ethan did the thing that told the whole plateau finally and forever exactly what kind of man he was. He walked over to the ruined colonel. And he didn't gloat. He put out his hand. "It's not too late, Marcus," Ethan said quietly, just for him. "The audit's going to be brutal. You're going to lose the command, probably the star you were chasing. But a man can start over at any age. I did. 3 years ago I was a legend, and I gave it all up to learn how to braid a little girl's hair. And I'm telling you the second life's better than the first if you let it be. The day you can stand in front of men and say I was wrong, teach me that's the day you actually become the leader you've been pretending to be all these years." He held the hand out steady. "The wind humbles everybody, Colonel, sooner or later. The only question that's ever mattered is whether you let it teach you or let it break you. It's still your choice, even now, even today." And for a long, long moment, Colonel Marcus Hale looked at that outstretched hand. The whole plateau held its breath, because they all understood that they were watching a man stand at the exact crossroads of the rest of his life, and that the hand Ethan was holding out was not just a hand, it was a door. The only door out of 30 years of fear, and all Hale had to do was take it. And in the end, he couldn't. He looked at the hand, and his face hardened one last time, the fear winning the way it always had, and he said low and bitter, "Save your speeches, Carter. I don't need life lessons from a man who quit." And he turned and he walked toward the helicopter that would take him off the mountain, his back straight, his eagles still on his shoulders. For a few more hours, a man who had been handed the only thing that could have saved him and could not make his hand close around it. Ethan watched him go. And there was no triumph in it. There was only that old, deep sadness. The sadness of a marksman who reads every wind, standing on a ridge in the falling light, watching a man walk into a storm he refused to see, holding a door open for someone who would rather freeze than admit he was cold. "You gave him more than he deserved," Reyes said quietly, coming up beside him. "Everybody deserves the door held open, Ray," Ethan said, still watching the colonel's retreating back. "That's the whole job. You hold it open. What they do with it is theirs." He finally turned away. "I've buried a lot of men. The only ones that still keep me up at night are the ones I never offered the door to because I'd already decided they weren't worth it. I decided that about a man once and I was wrong, and it cost him everything." He didn't explain, and Reyes didn't ask. "I'm done deciding who's worth a door. I hold it open for everybody now, even Hale, especially Hale." It was 6:30, and the sun was almost down, and the mission was real now in a way it hadn't been an hour ago. The 5 men were geared and briefed on the first layer. The helicopter that would take them off the mountain to the airfield was fueling, and Ethan stood at the edge of the plateau, looking out at the canyon one last time, the canyon that had beaten 40 men and finally given up its secrets, and he felt the old weight settling onto his shoulders. The weight he'd set down 3 years ago and sworn he'd never pick up again. Danny Vasquez came and stood beside him. The boy had called his mother. Ethan could see it in his face, the wrung-out look of a young man who'd just told his mom that Dad was alive and that strangers were flying across the world tonight to try to bring him home, and that he, her son the shooter, was staying behind. "She okay?" Ethan asked. "No," Danny said honestly, "but she understood. When I told her why I was staying. When I told her what you said about being the thing he comes home to." The boy's voice caught. She said your chief sounds like he's lost somebody. She said only a man who's buried somebody talks like that." And Ethan was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the canyon. "Your mom's a smart woman," he said finally. That was all. But it was enough, and Danny understood that he'd been given something, a small, true piece of a man who gave those pieces to almost no one. "Chief," Danny said, "the men you picked, the Marine, the Master Sergeant, the others, are they good enough? Tell me the truth. That's my dad." Ethan turned and looked at the boy, and he didn't give him the easy answer because he'd promised himself an hour ago he'd never lie to this kid. "They're not the best shooters on this mountain, Danny," Ethan said. "You know that. You watch them all day. There are men going home tonight who could outshoot every one of the 5 I picked." He let that sit and watched the fear flicker in the boy's eyes, and then he finished it. "I didn't pick them to make the shot. I'm making the shot. That part's mine, I promised you that. I picked them for everything that happens after the shot. For the part where somebody has to run into the open and pick your father up off the ground and carry him out while the whole world comes apart. And for carrying a broken man out of hell and loving him the whole way, those 5 are the best on earth. I'd bet my life on it." He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I am betting my life on it, tomorrow night. That's how sure I am." And Danny looked at the 5 men geared up now, checking each other's kit the way brothers do. And he saw them differently than he had that morning, saw them the way Ethan saw them. And something in the boy's face eased just slightly. "Okay," Danny whispered. "Okay." The last thing that happened on the mountain before they flew out, the thing that none of the 40 men would ever forget, the thing they'd tell. For the rest of their lives, happened at 6:45, right as the sun touched the far ridge. Ethan gathered the 5 he'd chosen, and he didn't give them a speech about tactics. He didn't go over the plan again. Reyes would do all that on the plane. Instead, Ethan Carter, the legend, the ghost, the man with the classified record, Ask them a question. One question. He went down the line, and he asked each man the same thing quietly, looking each one dead in the eye. "There's a man on the other side of the world," Ethan said to the first one, the Marine. "You've never met him. He's not your father, not your brother, not your friend. He's a stranger. And he's on his knees in the dark tonight, and he doesn't know if anybody's coming. I'm going to ask you to get on a plane in a few hours and fly toward the worst place on earth to go get him. And you might not come back." Ethan's eyes held the young Marines. "So I need to hear you say it, out loud. Are you willing to risk everything you've got? Everything for one American you've never met?" And the Marine, the quiet one, the one who'd missed all day, looked back at the chief and said without a flicker of hesitation, "Yes, Chief. He's one of ours. That's all I need to know." Ethan moved down the line. Asked the master sergeant with the gray mustache the same question. And the old man, 51 years old, a decade past, when he should have retired, said, "Chief, I've got a photograph of a man in my wallet I carried out of a bad place 30 years ago. He named his son after me. I go so somebody else gets to carry a photograph like that. Yes, 1,000 times yes." Down the line. Every man. The same question. And every man, one after another, without hesitation, said yes. Not because they were ordered to. Not because of rank or pride or medals. But because somewhere in the long, brutal, humbling day, they'd just lived through a man in a gray jacket had reminded them of the only thing that had ever made the work worth doing, the thing Colonel Hale had sneered at all day and never once understood. That you go. When a fellow American is on his knees in the dark and doesn't know if anyone's coming, you go. Not for glory, not for rank, not for the record. You go because he's one of ours, and that is the whole and entire reason, and it is enough, and it has always been enough. And when Ethan had gone all the way down the line and heard all 5 men say yes, he stood back and he looked at them. These 5 ordinary men he'd chosen, not for their scores, but for their hearts, and his own throat was tight. "All right," Ethan Carter said quietly as the sun went down behind the ridge and the canyon fell into shadow at last. "Then let's go get him." Before the helicopter lifted off that mountain, Ethan Carter did one thing that surprised everyone. He asked Reyes to hold the bird for 20 minutes. "We're on a clock, Ethan," Reyes said. "You said it yourself." "I know what I said. 20 minutes. There's a phone call I have to make, and it can't wait, because if I don't make it now, I won't be able to make it at all once we're wheels up, and I made a promise to somebody a lot smaller than all of this that I'd never leave without saying goodbye." He looked at the general. 3 years ago, I swore to a little girl that I was done, that I'd never pick up a rifle again. And tonight I'm breaking that promise, and I am not going to break it in the dark without her hearing my voice first. So give me 20 minutes, Ray. Please." And Reyes, who had a daughter of his own once a long time ago, before the work took everything, looked at the chief and said quietly, "Take 30. Ethan walked to the edge of the plateau away from the men, and he pulled out his phone, and he dialed a number he knew better than his own name, and it rang twice. And then a woman answered, an older woman, warm and tired. The neighbor who watched Lily when the world pulled Ethan away. "Margaret," Ethan said. "It's me. Is she still up?" "She's up, Ethan. She won't sleep till she talks to you, you know that." A pause. "Everything okay, honey? You sound funny." "Everything's fine." He lied gently, the way you lie to protect the people you love. "Just put her on for me, would you? And Margaret, I might be gone a few more days than I said. I'm real sorry to ask." There was a silence on the line, the silence of a woman who had lived long enough to hear what a man wasn't saying. "You come home, Ethan Carter," Margaret said finally, her voice thick. "Whatever it is, you come home to that baby girl." "That's the plan," he said. And then there was a rustle, and a small breathless voice came on the line, and Ethan Carter, the legend, the ghost, the man who read the wind off a hawk's wing, closed his eyes and leaned his whole heart into the phone. "Daddy." "Hey, Star," he said, and his voice broke a little on it, and he was glad she couldn't see his face. "Hey, my Lily girl, how was school today?" And she told him. All of it. The whole rushing river of a 6-year-old's day. The boy who ate glue, the picture she drew of a horse that looked more like a dog. The loose tooth that was finally about to come out, and Ethan stood on a mountain on the far edge of the country with 5 armed men behind him and a hostage on his knees on the other side of the world, and he listened to every single word about the loose tooth like it was the most important intelligence he'd ever received in his life. Because it was. It was the whole reason for everything. It was the thing he was defending, the thing he'd walked away from the whole terrible business to have, and it was the thing that would keep his hands steady when the moment came. "Daddy," Lily said when the river ran out. "When are you coming home?" And Ethan Carter had to breathe once slow before he could answer. "Real soon, baby," he said. "Daddy's got to help a friend first, a friend who's far away and needs some help getting home to his family. Just like I always come home to you." He swallowed. "There's a boy, Lily. A big boy, all grown up. And his daddy is far away and can't get home. So I'm going to go help his daddy get home. Because every daddy should get to come home to his kid. Every single one. You understand?" There was a small quiet on the line, while a 6-year-old thought about that with the whole enormous seriousness of a 6-year-old. "Is the boy scared?" Lily asked. And Ethan's throat closed all the way, and he had to look up at the last light in the sky to keep himself together, because that was the question. Wasn't it? That was the only question, and his little girl had found it in half a second. "Yeah, baby," he said softly. "The boy's real scared." "Then you have to go," Lily said, simple and certain the way only a child can be. "You have to go help. Tell the boy his daddy's coming home. Tell him you promised. Your promises always come true, Daddy." And Ethan Carter, on a mountaintop with the whole weight of the world on him, laughed a wet, broken laugh because there it was. There was the whole thing, the entire meaning of everything he'd learned in 50 years of a hard life, delivered by a gap-toothed 6-year-old who thought a horse looked like a dog. "I'll tell him, Star," he whispered. "I promise. I love you more than the whole sky. Now you go to sleep, and when you wake up a few times, Daddy'll be home. Okay. Love you more than the sky and the space behind the sky. That's more than me. That's cheating." "I know," she said, delighted, and he could hear her grin. And then she was gone. Handed back to Margaret, and the line went quiet, and Ethan Carter stood on the mountain with the phone still pressed to his ear, long after the call had ended, holding on to the last echo of her voice, like a man holds onto a rope over a canyon. Then he put the phone away, and he turned around. And the man who turned around was different from the man who'd walked to the edge of the plateau. The softness was still there, would always be there now. That was the whole point. But underneath it, the old thing had come fully awake, the still and terrible focus, the marksman, the ghost. Because he'd remembered in his daughter's voice exactly what he was fighting for. And a man who remembers what he's fighting for does not miss. "All right," Ethan said, walking back to the men. "Let's go bring a daddy home." They flew through the night, and then they flew through another night, chasing the dark across the world. And Ethan Carter did not sleep, but he was not tired either, because he'd entered the place he went. Before a thing like this. The still white room at the center of himself, where there was no fear and no doubt and no past, only the next breath and the next. The plan was simple because the good ones always are. A small team in quiet under the cover of dark. The 5 men would move in close to the compound where Ray Vasquez was being held close enough to hit the guards and cover the extraction. And Ethan would be somewhere else entirely alone, far back on high ground with a rifle and the wind, because the whole plan rested on one thing that only one man in the world could do. There were 2 guard positions elevated dug in, with a clear field of fire onto the courtyard, where the team would have to cross to reach Vasquez. If either of those positions was manned, when the team moved, the team died in the open, and Vasquez died with them. And they could not be reached quietly. They could only be reached across a valley in the dark and the wind by a shot that the planners in the windowless building had run through their models and concluded was, in their words, not feasible. Reyes had looked at the model, and then he'd looked at Ethan, and he'd said, "They're telling me this shot can't be made." And Ethan had said, They told me that once before, 15 years ago, about the same man. And that had been the end of the conversation. It was 0300 local time when the team moved into position, and Ethan lay alone on the high ground with the rifle and keyed his radio once softly. "Overwatch is set," he said. "I have eyes on both guard positions. 2 tangos, both manned." A pause. "I can only take one at a time. When I fire on the first, the second one's going to know something's wrong. You're going to have a window of about 4 seconds between my first shot and my second. That's the whole mission right there. 4 seconds. Everybody understand the 4 seconds?" 5 clicks came back over the radio. "Yes." "Marine," Ethan said. "You're on point. When my first round goes, you move. Don't wait for the second. You trust that the second one's coming and you move on the first. Can you do that? Can you run into the open on faith that a man you met 2 days ago is going to clear the second tower before it kills you?" A pause. Then the Marine's voice steady in the dark. "Chief, I ran into the open on that range for nothing but a piece of steel. I'll do it for a man's father without thinking twice." And Ethan Carter, lying in the dark on the far side of the world, smiled because that was the exact moment he knew he'd chosen right back on the mountain when he'd left the best shooter home and taken the man who'd run into the open for a piece of steel. "Good man," Ethan said softly. "Everybody hold. I'm reading the wind. And here is the thing that Danny Vasquez would never see. That no camera recorded, that lived only in the memory of 5 men and 1 general listening 10,000 miles away on a secure line holding his breath." Ethan Carter read the wind. There was a valley between him and the 2 towers, and it was night, and the wind in a valley at night does things that daylight never shows you. It pools. It runs cold down the slopes and rivers along the bottom and swirls where the terrain narrows. And Ethan could not see. It could not feel. Most of it could only read it in the smallest signs, in the way a distant flag moved at the edge of the compound light, in the drift of the cook-fire smoke. A half-mile off in the cold current. He felt on the 1 exposed inch of his own cheek. It was the 3rd wind all over again, the invisible killer, the one that beat lesser men, except now there was no do-over, no reset, no colonel to blame. Now there was a man on his knees, in a room 100 meters past those towers, and a boy on the other side of the world who'd been promised, and a 6-year-old who believed her daddy's promises always came true. "Wind's moving," Ethan breathed into the radio more to himself than to them. "Left to right valley floor quartering. Maybe 8 gusting 12. There's a cold pocket in the low ground that's going to grab the round for about 200 meters mid-flight and shove it. Same as the canyon. Exact same as the canyon." He settled the rifle deeper. "First target's the north tower," he said. "Then the 4 seconds. Then the south. Nobody breathes until I call both down. 10,000 miles away in a room with no windows." General Reyes closed his eyes. And on a mountain back home, though, he couldn't hear any of it. Danny Vasquez sat awake by a phone that would not ring for hours, holding a photograph of his father, whispering the same thing over and over into the dark. "Come on, Chief. Come on. You promised. You promised," Ethan breathed out. "All the way." To the still and empty place at the bottom of the breath, the place he'd told 40 snipers about on a mountaintop. The place where the wind goes quiet, because the thing you're doing matters more than you do. And he thought about Ray Vasquez on his knees in the dark, not knowing anyone was coming. And he thought about a boy who'd run into the open for a piece of steel. And he thought about a 6-year-old who said, "Tell him his daddy's coming home." And the wind got quiet. He sent the first round. It flew across the valley in the dark, and it dropped into the cold pocket in the low ground, and something invisible grabbed it and shoved it. And Ethan had known it would had held for. It had aimed into a wind he could not feel the way he'd taught them all to do. And the round came back online in the last 100 meters and found the North Tower, and the threat in it was gone before the sound ever arrived. And the 4 seconds began. The Marine moved on the first shot, just like he'd promised. Ran into the open on faith, into the courtyard exposed, trusting a man he'd met 2 days ago to clear the second tower before it cut him down. And behind him, the other 4 flowed out of the dark exactly as they'd planned, exactly as men who'd learned on a mountain that you don't cross the open alone. And in the south tower, the second guard came up alerted, swinging his weapon toward the movement in the courtyard, toward the Marine running in the open with no cover and no time. 2 seconds gone. Ethan was already there. He'd cycled the bolt in the space of a heartbeat, the old motion, the motion his hands had never forgotten in 3 years of packing lunches and braiding hair. And he'd read the wind's second gust, felt it shift, adjusted for a current that had changed in the 4 seconds since his first shot. Because the wind is never the same wind twice, and lesser men die learning that. 3 seconds gone. The guard's weapon coming level. The Marine dead in the open. And Ethan Carter, single father on the far side of the world, with his daughter's voice still in his ears, and his whole steady heart behind the rifle, made the second shot. It flew true, into the same cold pocket, held for the same shove, corrected for the new gust. And it crossed the valley in the dark, and reached the south tower in the last quarter second, before that weapon could fire, and the threat was gone, and the courtyard was clear, and the Marine reached the far wall alive. North tower down, south tower down, Ethan breathed. Courtyard's clear. Go get him. Go get him now. What happened next happened fast the way these things do, and Ethan watched all of it through his scope, and could do nothing but watch because his job was done. And now it was in the hands of the 5 men he'd chosen, the 5 ordinary men with extraordinary hearts. They breached the room, and there on his knees in the dark, exactly where the intel said he'd be, was Master Sergeant Raymond Vasquez. 4 days a prisoner. Beaten. Weak. Unable to stand. Dead weight in a doorway with the whole world about to come apart. The exact thing Ethan had warned Reyes about. The exact reason he'd left the best shooter home and taken the men who'd pick up something beneath them and carry it like it mattered. And the Master Sergeant with the gray mustache, 51 years old, a decade past, when he should have retired, got Ray Vasquez up onto his back, like the man weighed nothing, like he was carrying a photograph, and the other 4 formed up around them, a wall of bodies between the broken man and every bad thing in the world. And they moved. Ray Vasquez, half-conscious, ruined, barely able to speak, lifted his head off the Master Sergeant's shoulder as they crossed the courtyard, and he looked up at the dark hills where the covering fire had come from the 2 impossible shots that had opened the door to his freedom. And something moved behind his ruined eyes. Some old memory, some recognition that couldn't be, and he rasped out 3 words that the Master Sergeant would repeat to Ethan later, and that Ethan would carry for the rest of his life. "It's him," Ray Vasquez whispered. "It's the chief. He came back." Because 15 years ago, pinned down out of ammo with a wounded man, he wouldn't leave Ray Vasquez, had been saved by an impossible shot from 1,400 meters in bad wind. And he had never seen the man who fired it. But he had spent 15 years knowing that somewhere out there was a ghost who'd given him back his life, a ghost who'd let him go home and hold his baby son and watch that boy grow into a man. And now, on his knees in the dark, on the worst night of his life, that same ghost had reached across the world one more time and opened the door again. "He came back," Ray Vasquez said again, weeping now as 5 strangers carried him out of hell. "He came back for me." They made the extraction point. The bird came in low and fast out of the dark, and the 5 men and the 1 broken Master Sergeant they'd carried out lifted off the ground and away, and it was over, and it had worked, and every single one of them was alive, because a man in a gray jacket had chosen them, not for their aim, but for their hearts, and because that same man had lain alone on a hill and made 2 shots that the models said couldn't be made. Ethan Carter broke down his rifle in the dark, alone calm, the way he'd done 1,000 times, and he keyed the radio one last time. "Overwatch is off the hill," he said. "All packages secure. Everybody's coming home." A pause. And then quieter, just for the one man 10,000 miles away who'd know what it meant. "Ray, tell him it's the chief. Tell him I said the wind was quiet." And in a room with no windows, a 2-star general put his face in his hands and wept 40 years of it all. The letters he'd written. All the men who hadn't come home. All of it because this time This one time they all came home. And it was because of a single father who'd given up a legend to learn how to braid a little girl's hair and had picked the rifle up one last time to keep a promise to a boy. Ray Vasquez lived. He was broken, and it took months, but he lived, and he went home, and the first face he saw when he came off the plane was his son's. Danny Vasquez ran across that tarmac and grabbed his father, and neither one of them could speak. They just held on a boy, and the man who'd taught him to ride a bike together again on the right side of the world and standing back from all of it off to the side, in a plain gray jacket, was a man nobody in the crowd recognized, watching quiet, the way he always watched. And Danny saw him. Over his father's shoulder, through his tears, Danny saw the chief standing at the edge of everything, and the boy understood in that instant everything the man had done. The impossible shots the promise kept. The door held open all of it, and Danny opened his mouth to call out to him, to bring him into it, to let the whole crowd know that this quiet man in the gray jacket was the reason any of them were standing there at all. But Ethan Carter caught his eye, and he smiled small and warm. And he shook his head just slightly. No, don't. This moment belongs to you and your dad. Not to me. It was never about me. And he lifted one hand, a small wave, one father to a son, and then he turned and he walked toward the parking lot, toward an old pickup truck with a photograph of a gap-toothed 6-year-old clipped to the sun visor. And he was gone back into the ordinary life he'd chosen over the legend, back to loose teeth and badly braided hair and tiny chairs at parent-teacher nights. Because that was the whole truth of Ethan Carter. The truth that Colonel Marcus Hale had never understood, the truth that a JSOC general had flown up a mountain to salute, the truth that a 6-year-old had known all along. The strongest man on that mountain was never the loudest one. He was the one who held the door open for the man who threw him in the dirt. He was the one who left the best shooter home and took the men with the biggest hearts. He was the one whose hands got steadier the more it mattered, because he'd learned the only secret that has ever mattered in this life. That you don't do the impossible thing for yourself. You do it for the person waiting on the other end. And when you do, the wind gets quiet. Colonel Hale lost his command. The audit was every bit as brutal as Ethan had promised, and it found exactly what Ethan said it would: 3 years of good men written off as failures, rather than one man admitting there was a sky he didn't understand. Hale never took the door. Some men never do. He walked into the storm he refused to see, and the storm took him, and there was nobody to blame for it, but the man in the mirror he'd spent 30 years shouting past. But the 5 men Ethan chose, they told the story for the rest of their lives. And every young operator who came up after them learned the lesson, not from a manual, but from the men who'd lived it. The lesson that a team of average shooters who die for each other will bring a hostage home faster than a team of the best shooters in the world, who are each only thinking of themselves. And the master sergeant with the gray mustache carried a new photograph in his wallet. After that, right next to the old one, a photo of a man he'd pulled out of the dark on the far side of the world, and when young men asked him about it, he'd say the same thing every time. He'd say, "I learned everything I know about being a soldier from a man in blue jeans that a colonel threw in the dirt." And then he'd close the wallet and say nothing more, because some things you don't explain. You just carry them. And Ethan Carter drove home through the dark, and he pulled into his driveway just as the sun was coming up, and he went inside quiet so he wouldn't wake Margaret, and he walked down the hall to a small room with a paper star on the door, and he pushed it open, and there she was, his whole reason, his whole sky asleep, with one arm flung over the side of the bed and her mouth open, 6 years old, safe home. And Ethan Carter, the legend, the ghost, the chief, the man who read the wind off a hawk's wing and made the shots that couldn't be made, knelt down beside his daughter's bed and put his hand on her back and felt her breathing in and out, and he closed his eyes. And for the first time in 3 years, the old weight lifted all the way off his shoulders, because he understood at last that he had not betrayed his promise to her by picking up the rifle one more time. He had kept it. He had gone out into the dark and made sure that another child got to keep her father, that another son got to run across a tarmac and hold the man who taught him to ride a bike. And then he had come home exactly like he always did. exactly like he'd promised to. The only rank that had ever mattered to him, the only title he'd ever fight the whole world to keep. Not chief, not legend, not the ghost with the classified record. Dad. Lily stirred, and her eyes opened halfway, and she saw him there in the gray light, and she smiled the sleepy, gap-toothed smile that was the reason for everything. "Daddy?" she murmured. "You came home." "I always come home, Star," Ethan Carter whispered, and he kissed her forehead, and he meant it with every cell of a body the world had spent a lifetime teaching to be hard, and a little girl had finally taught to be soft. "I will always, always come home to you." And he did. That is the whole truth of the man, and it is enough, and it will always be enough. The greatest warrior any of them ever knew was measured not by his rank, not by his record, not by the impossible shots he made in the dark on the far side of the world, but by the small, warm hand that held his in the gray light of morning, and by the simple, unbreakable, fully kept promise that no matter how far the dark called him, no matter what door he had to hold open, or what storm he had to walk into, he would always come home, and he always did.